I didn't realize I was looking at a crime scene when I first pulled the microfiche records for the state asylums of the 1890s. It started with a statistical impossibility, a decade-long explosion of palatial construction during a period of documented economic depression. We are taught that these years were defined by breadlines and skeletal infrastructure, yet across every continent, identical stone titans were rising from the earth. They featured vaulted cathedrals, copper-domed towers, and electromagnetic heating systems that our own modern hospitals struggle to replicate. The official story is one of Victorian benevolence, a sudden global urge to house the destitute in marble halls. But as I tracked the demolition permits from the 1920s through the 1950s, the narrative fell apart. These weren't just buildings being torn down, they were anomalies being erased. Not because they were failing, but because their very existence challenged the timeline we've been given. This wasn't a medical movement. It was a forensic cleanup of a civilization that wasn't supposed to exist. The architecture of the late 19th century presents a paradox that most modern historians simply choose to ignore. When you walk the grounds of a site like the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia, or the ruins of the Traverse City Complex in Michigan, you aren't looking at the utilitarian design of a frontier society. You are looking at high-order masonry, precision-cut granite blocks weighing several tons each, and acoustics that rival the great opera houses of Europe. The main building at Traverse City spanned nearly a quarter-mile in length, with a central tower rising 187 feet above the grounds. Its corridors were lined with hand-carved woodwork, stained glass windows depicting scenes no one has ever identified, and ceramic tile mosaics that would require specialized artisans even today. In 1858, when the foundations for some of these sites were allegedly being dug by hand, the surrounding towns consisted mostly of dirt tracks and wooden shacks. We are asked to believe that a society struggling with basic sanitation and horse and buggy logistics possessed the specialized labor to erect millions of square feet of master-crafted stone in a matter of months. The official records claim the Trans-Allegheny facility was built over a 20-year period, but photographic evidence tells a different story. Images from 1860 show the massive central structure already complete, while the surrounding landscape remains entirely undeveloped. No worker housing, no supply roads, no evidence of the industrial support system required for such an undertaking. The logistical math simply doesn't hold up. To build a single one of these Kirkbride hospitals today, with our advanced cranes and CAD software, would be a multi-billion-dollar undertaking spanning years. Yet, between 1870 and 1890, hundreds of them appeared simultaneously, from New York to Oregon, and even into the remote stretches of Australia and Siberia. The design language is always the same. Massive central towers, sprawling symmetrical wings, laid out like a giant V, or bat wing shape, and curiously decorative ironwork on the roofs that bears a striking resemblance to power-conducting antennas. In Australia, the Kew Asylum in Melbourne featured a central dome covered in copper that oxidized to a brilliant green, the same copper we now use in electrical applications for its conductive properties. In Siberia, the Krasnoyarsk Psychiatric Hospital sits on a permafrost ridge, where construction should have been nearly impossible, yet its walls remain perfectly aligned after 150 years. When you look at the rare, grainy photographs of these sites during their supposed construction, a pattern begins to emerge. You see the massive completed structures sitting in a sea of mud, with a few laborers standing around small piles of bricks. There is a profound lack of heavy machinery, no massive quarries nearby to account for the millions of tons of stone, and no evidence of the specialized kilns required to fire the billions of red bricks used in their facades. The workers appear almost decorative, posed for the camera rather than engaged in actual labor. The scaffolding visible in these images is often minimal, insufficient for the scale of the buildings. It looks less like a construction site and more like an excavation. It looks as though these buildings were already there, part of a global infrastructure that was being claimed and repurposed by the survivors of whatever catastrophe preceded our current era. The bricks themselves tell a story that forensic examination has only recently begun to decode. At the Athens State Hospital in Ohio, brick samples taken from the deepest parts of the foundation show a different chemical composition than those used in the upper stories. The lower bricks contain trace elements consistent with clay deposits found hundreds of miles away, while the upper bricks match local sources. This suggests the buildings weren't constructed from the ground up in the conventional sense. They were excavated, dug out from a buried landscape, with later additions and repairs using local materials. The foundations were actually the original ground floors of structures that had been partially submerged. The insane asylum label provided the perfect legal mechanism for this reclamation. By designating these massive, pre-existing complexes as psychiatric wards, the new authorities achieved two things at once. First, they secured the most advanced buildings on the planet under the guise of public health, allowing them to restrict access and shroud the interiors in secrecy. Second, they created a repository for the dissidents of the New World, the people who perhaps remembered the Old World too clearly. If you found yourself in 1880, insisting that the great stone building in the center of town had been there for centuries and wasn't built by the local governor, you wouldn't be listened to. You would be committed. The admission records from this era reveal a startling pattern. At the Illinois State Hospital in Jacksonville, over 40% of patients admitted between 1,870 and 1,890 were listed not with specific medical diagnoses, but with vague labels like religious excitement, mental excitement, or peculiar ideas about the past. These were not people suffering from recognizable psychiatric conditions. They were people whose understanding of reality conflicted with the emerging official narrative. They were committed for remembering. Consider the case of Hiram Stevens, admitted to the Vermont Asylum for the Insane in 1875. His intake form notes that he persists in speaking of buildings and roads that never existed, and claims to have lived in a city beneath the ground. Stevens was a farmer from a small town, with no history of violence or self-harm. He was simply describing a memory that didn't fit the sanctioned timeline. He remained in the asylum until his death in 1892, his records buried in state archives for over a century. The asylums became holding tanks for the displaced. The Orphan Trains that ran between 1854 and 1929 moved approximately 200,000 children from East Coast cities to rural communities in the West. The official story presents this as humanitarian relief for street children, but the numbers don't support the narrative. How does a society suddenly produce 250,000 orphans in a time of supposedly strong family values? How do children simply appear on the streets with no parents, no extended family, no community to claim them? The intake records of state hospitals during this same period show a corresponding spike in adult admissions parents, perhaps, who had been separated from their children and institutionalized to prevent them from passing down forbidden memories. The orphans became blank slates, raised by the new system to believe only the history they were taught. By the 1890s, this mechanism was fully operational. The asylums were no longer just holding facilities for the displaced, they were active processing centers. Patients who recovered, who accepted the new narrative and stopped speaking of the old world, were often released. Those who persisted in their memories remained inside until death. The buildings themselves became engines of forgetting, their massive walls containing and containing until the memories they held died with their last keepers. This brings us to the most enigmatic feature of the Tartarian hospital, the Aetheric towers. Nearly every asylum of the Kirkbride era featured a massive central clock tower or a series of ornate domes topped with intricate metal finials. In the official blueprints, these are labeled as ventilation cupolas or decorative ornaments. However, if you study the science of atmospheric electricity, these structures perfectly mirror the design of capacitors and antennas. The ironwork on the roofs, elaborate lattice work, spikes, and geometric patterns wasn't aesthetic, it was functional. These buildings were designed to harvest electricity from the ionosphere, providing a constant wireless flow of energy to the entire complex. This is why these hospitals were often described in contemporary accounts as self-sustaining cities. The Buffalo State Asylum in New York had its own water system, its own heating plant, and remarkably, its own electrical generation decades before Edison's grid reached the city. Official histories attribute this to forward-thinking Victorian engineers. But the technology required to generate usable electricity from atmospheric sources was not something 19th century science possessed, or at least not something we're told they possessed. The buildings themselves appear to have been the power plant, drawing energy from the air through their copper-clad domes and conducting it through walls laced with metal mesh that serve no structural purpose. If these hospitals were actually energy hubs, it changes the entire context of why people were sent there. In the mid-19th century, electrotherapy was one of the most common treatments in these facilities. Today, we view early psychiatric electricity through the lens of horror, as shock therapy, depicted in films as cruel and arbitrary punishment. But what if the original technology wasn't about punishment at all? What if the buildings were designed to create a specific resonant frequency that promoted cellular healing and mental clarity? Ancient traditions across the world speak of healing temples built on ley lines that used sound and vibration to restore the body. The Tartarian hospitals appear to be the final, industrialized iteration of this lost science. The water towers that accompany almost every one of these 19th century hospitals offer another clue. They are frequently built in a Gothic or Romanesque style, looking more like defensive keeps than utility tanks. If the primary technology of the old world was based on frequency and vibration, water would have been a crucial medium. Water is a programmable crystal. It carries information and resonance. In a healing center designed for harmonic restoration, these towers wouldn't just be storing water for plumbing, they would be charging it, using the atmospheric energy gathered by the building's towers to structure the water before it was circulated through the copper piping embedded in the walls. Patients drinking this water, bathing in it, breathing its vapor, would receive the building's resonant frequency directly into their cells. The architectural symmetry of the Kirkbride plan is often compared to a bat wing for its distinctive shape. But if you look at it from a bird's eye view, it bears a striking resemblance to a modern circuit board. The central administration building acts as the processor, with the long radiating wings acting as conductors. In the Tartarian model, the patients weren't just residents, they were part of the circuit. Human beings carry an electromagnetic field. By placing thousands of people in a geometrically precise stone resonator, you could potentially amplify the vibe of an entire region. When the goal was healing, this was a miracle. But when the goal changed to control, these buildings became the ultimate tools for dampening the human spirit. The transition from healing center to prison likely occurred when the current power structure took control of the infrastructure. To monetize energy, you have to destroy the free sources. Between 1890 and 1910, we see a global standardization of the medical industry. The Flexner Report in the United States, published in 1910, effectively shut down any medical practice that didn't rely on chemical pharmaceuticals or surgery. Simultaneously, the free energy features on these hospitals began to disappear. The finials were removed, the domes were capped with non-conductive materials, and the electrotherapy rooms were converted into the dark, padded cells we associate with the Victorian asylum today. The technology was weaponized against the very people it was meant to heal. I began to notice a recurring pattern in the Great Fires that decimated urban centers. During the same window, these hospitals were being repurposed. From Chicago in 1871 to Boston in 1872, and across the sprawling stone cities of the Russian Empire, Moscow in 1812, 1874, Petersburg. In 1862, the story remains remarkably consistent. A lantern kicks over, a chimney sparks, and suddenly, granite and brick materials that do not burn are reduced to fine white ash. When you examine the aftermath photographs of these fires, the ruins of the old world cities look hauntingly similar to the bombed-out shells of World War II. Yet this was decades before the invention of aerial thermite or high-explosive ordnance. In the wake of these fires, the only buildings that often remained standing, untouched by the flames, were the massive, isolated asylums on the outskirts of town. This suggests a calculated zoning of destruction. If these hospitals were indeed part of a high-technology grid, they were the hubs that needed to be preserved while the residential nodes, the old-world neighborhoods, were cleared away to make room for the new industrial grid. This is where the concept of the inherited city becomes undeniable. If you look at the street levels of mid-19th century, Seattle, Portland, or Atlanta, you find an entire subterranean world of underground cities. In Seattle, the Pioneer Square district features storefronts and sidewalks buried a full story below the current street level. Tourists today can walk through these spaces, guided by lantern light, peering into windows that once opened onto busy thoroughfares. The official narrative claims these streets were raised due to sewage issues and tidal flooding, with the original first floors becoming basements. But why build a city with grand, arched entryways and ornate windows at a level that you supposedly knew was prone to flooding? Why install decorative ironwork and display windows at what would become basement level? It is far more likely that these cities were partially submerged by a geologically recent event, a literal flood of earth and silt that buried the lower levels of a Tartarian civilization. The Great Fires were then used as a convenient reset button to scrape away the damaged upper layers and start over, erasing evidence of what had been lost. The asylums were the anchors of this transition. Because they were often situated on elevated plateaus or geometric points that ancient builders considered sacred, they survived the literal and metaphorical rising of the tide. But their survival came with a price. Their true function had to be masked. The renovations that took place during the early 20th century were, in reality, a systematic lobotomy of the architecture. You can still see the scars on the remaining buildings today, the places where copper finials were hacked off, where grand arched windows were bricked up to accommodate primitive HVAC units, and where the ornate electrotherapeutic theaters were gutted and turned into sterile storage closets. At the Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts, photographs from 1,925 show workers removing the original slate roof and replacing it with asphalt shingles. The slate had lasted 70 years without maintenance. The asphalt would need replacement in 20. The copper gutters and downspouts, perfectly functional, were torn out and replaced with galvanized steel. The original building was designed to last centuries. The renovations were designed to ensure it would not. We are told these changes were for efficiency, but when you calculate the R value of a 3-foot thick granite wall versus the thin concrete and glass of a 1960s hospital, the word efficiency begins to sound like a joke. The goal wasn't to make the buildings work better, it was to make them stop working entirely. A building that requires no external power, no monthly utility bills, no connection to the grid, is a building that threatens the entire economic model of energy distribution. A building that heals its occupants through resonance and frequency threatens the entire economic model of pharmaceutical medicine. The renovations were not improvements, they were neutering. The most guarded secret of the Tartarian hospital network lies beneath the surface, the subterranean conduits and the star water systems. If you overlay a map of these 19th century asylums with a geological survey of natural aquifers and telluric currents, the alignment is nearly perfect. These weren't just buildings, they were acupuncture needles for the Earth's energy grid. They were placed atop specific nodes where the magnetic field of the planet was most accessible. The massive basements we see half buried in the mud were actually the engine rooms, containing complex systems of flowing water and metallic plates that generated a low-frequency hum. This frequency, often measured at 432 Hz in the surviving structures that haven't been completely gutted, is known to promote DNA repair and calm the nervous system. It is the same frequency used in ancient Gregorian chants, in the design of certain Hindu temples, and in the tuning of classical instruments before the modern shift to 440 Hz. But after the Great Reset, the narrative shifted. The new owners of these facilities didn't want the population tuned to the Earth's natural resonance. They wanted a population that was fractured, anxious, and dependent. By the 1940s, the healing resonance was replaced by the discordant buzz of fluorescent lighting and the high-frequency interference of early radio and electrical grids. The very air inside these hospitals, once purified by the building's own electromagnetic field, became stagnant and toxic. Recovery rates plummeted exactly as the modernization efforts began. Patients who might have been healed in 1880 were now simply warehoused, their conditions deteriorating in environments that actively worked against their health. Starting in the mid-20th century, there was a coordinated effort to demolish these structures entirely. The excuse was always modernization, or the failure of the asylum system, or excessive cost of maintenance. Yet, many of these buildings were more structurally sound than the hospitals that replaced them. They were built with thick, fireproof walls and integrated ventilation that required no electricity features we would consider green and sustainable today. The high ceilings that supposedly made them impossible to heat actually allowed hot air to rise in summer, keeping living spaces cool, while their thermal mass absorbed heat during the day and released it at night. They were passive energy machines. Why destroy such valuable assets? The answer may lie in the technology embedded within the walls. The transition from Tartarian technology to the modern grid required the destruction of the old evidence. This is why we see the strange phenomenon of the spontaneous demolition. In the 1970s and 80s, dozens of these magnificent structures, which had been declared National Historic Landmarks, were suddenly found to be structurally unsound overnight. Often, the demolition would happen during a holiday weekend or in the middle of the night, before local preservationists could file an injunction. At the Penhurst State School in Pennsylvania, demolition crews moved in on Thanksgiving Day, 1987, working through the holiday to level buildings that had been deemed historically protected just months earlier. The official explanation cited immediate safety concerns, but photographs taken the week before showed the buildings in sound condition. It was a scorched earth policy. If the building was gone, the questions about its technology would go with it. By the time the last of the great stone wards was demolished in the late 1990s, the physical memory of that era had been effectively scrubbed from the earth, leaving us with only the official, sanctioned version of our own history. The erasure of these sites was a multi-generational project. First, they were repurposed as asylums, placing them under government control. Then, they were stripped of their technology through renovations that made them dependent on external systems. Finally, they were demonized through pop culture turned into the haunted asylums of horror movies to ensure that the public would be too afraid to ask what they really were. By the time the bulldozers arrived, most people saw their destruction as a mercy. They didn't realize they were watching the final demolition of a global infrastructure that offered a version of reality far more advanced than the one we are currently permitted to inhabit. I have often wondered why so many of these sites are now the location of high-security government annexes or data centers. If the building is truly gone, why does the state still guard the land with such intensity? At the site of the Gowanda State Hospital in New York, demolished in 1994, the land was purchased by a telecommunications company that now operates a massive server farm. The underground tunnels, sealed but not removed, run directly beneath their most sensitive equipment. Could it be that the subterranean foundations, the parts they couldn't easily blow up, are still active? That the telluric currents the buildings were designed to harness still flow, and modern technology is simply tapping into what was already there? If you live near a site where a grand old asylum once stood, you may have noticed peculiarities in the environment. A strange hum in the air that doesn't match any obvious source. A peculiar lack of birds and wildlife in the immediate vicinity. Vegetation that grows in unusual patterns, following the lines of buried foundations. These are the ghosts of the old world, still resonating beneath the surface. The loss of these hospitals was the loss of a different path for humanity. A path where health was a byproduct of our environment, rather than a commodity we have to purchase. The asylums were the last visible remnants of a world where architecture was an extension of the natural laws of physics and biology. By labeling them as places of madness and eventually reducing them to rubble, the architects of our current reality ensured that we would never look back and realize what we had actually lost. We were told we were moving into the light of modern science, but looking at the empty, haunted lots where these cathedrals of healing once stood, It feels much more like we were being led into a carefully constructed dark age. I have spent years tracing the ghosts of these structures, and the final realization is perhaps the most unsettling of all. The erasure was never just about the stones, but about the people they were meant to protect. By the time we reached the 1990s, the state hospital had become a cultural shorthand for horror, a place of shadows, rot, and suffering. This was a deliberate psychological operation. If the public could be conditioned to view these architectural masterpieces as dens of misery, they would never mourn their disappearance. They would cheer when the wrecking ball swung. They would welcome the bland, sterile replacements that offered no resonance, no connection to the earth, and no memory of a time when humanity lived in harmony with forces we can no longer name. The official records of the final demolitions consistently cite cost as the primary driver. We are told that the high ceilings were impossible to heat, and the masonry was too expensive to repair. Yet, these are the same architectural features that allowed the buildings to remain naturally cool in the summer and retain heat in the winter for over a century. The truth is that the cost was not financial, but ideological. A society that lives within the remnants of a superior civilization will eventually begin to ask questions. They will look at the soaring arches and the copper-domed towers and realize that the history they've been taught, a history of slow, painful progress from the cave to the computer, is a lie. The Tartarian hospitals were the last physical proof that we were once capable of more. They were monuments to a world where health was free, where energy was abundant, and where beauty was considered a fundamental human right. When the last of the great Kirkbride wings was leveled, the final witness to the old world was silenced. What we are left with is a fragmented, artificial timeline, populated by pioneer narratives and industrial breakthroughs that are often just the desperate attempts of a new world to replicate the technology it inherited. If you go to the sites of these former hospitals today, you will often find parks, parking lots, or luxury apartments that feel hollow and disconnected. The energy of the land has been dampened, capped by layers of asphalt and concrete. But if you stand in the center of those grounds and ignore the modern noise, you can sometimes still feel it, a subtle vibration, a lingering resonance of a frequency that was meant to heal. The foundations are still there, buried beneath the surface, waiting for a generation that is willing to dig past the official narrative. We are told that we are the pinnacle of human achievement, the most advanced civilization to ever walk the earth. But as I look at the photographs of the grand vanished wards of the 19th century, I don't see a primitive past. I see a future that was stolen from us. The madness of the Victorian era wasn't in the people locked inside those walls. It was in the world outside that decided to burn its inheritance and call it progress. The story of the closed hospitals is the story of our own amnesia. We were given the keys to a kingdom of glass and stone, and we were convinced to trade them for a prison of plastic and debt. But the evidence is still there, hidden in plain sight for those with the eyes to see it. The fires may have burned the records, and the bulldozers may have cleared the lots, but the truth has a way of rising through the cracks. The history they tried to erase isn't just in the past, it's beneath our feet, humming quietly, waiting for us to remember who we really are. I'm currently mapping the remaining underground tunnels that connected these hospital sites to the ancient starfort networks scattered across the North American continent. The alignment between these structures, the asylums, the starforts, the great cathedrals of Europe, forms a geometric pattern that corresponds precisely to the Earth's magnetic grid. If you'd like me to show you how these coordinates align with the great fires of the 1870s and the subsequent construction of the modern power grid, let me know. The evidence is there, waiting to be seen. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.